Welcome to Last Memories. I'm Timothy. Today, I found what I think are some of the most hilariously dumb deaths ever. From a woman arguing and forgetting to watch where she's standing, to a man who locks his apartment keys in his car and used a shortcut that fatally ends in the stupidest way ever.
It was November 16, 2014. Chatuchak Weekend Market in Bangkok draws over 200,000 visitors on a single weekend day. 35 acres of vendor stalls and stone-paved corridors where the midday crowd never fully stops moving. By early afternoon, the lanes were packed, and a 47-year-old man from Phoenix, Arizona was being carried out through a side entrance on a stretcher while his wife walked alongside him without speaking. Craig Moffat was a finance analyst with 11 years at a regional investment firm, precise and methodical at work, reliably reckless in small ways on vacation. His wife, Patricia, said that he had once balanced a coconut on his forehead in Cancun. He had also tried to crack a walnut with his elbow in Lisbon. Neither produced anything worse than embarrassment. His wife had long reduced her objections to a single warning per incident. They were 3 days into their first trip to Southeast Asia. She said that Chatuchak had been Craig's idea, pulled from a travel guide, a chance to find carved wooden objects for his home office. An hour into the stalls, he stopped at a fruit vendor and bought a mango skewer. A bamboo stick roughly 9 inches long, tapered to a sharp point, common at outdoor markets across the region. The market's corridors are paved with stone tiles that have settled unevenly over decades, their edges raised a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, worn smooth by foot traffic. In the densest stretches, pedestrians rarely looked down. Craig had eaten most of the mango and still held the skewer when he needed both hands free to search his backpack for his wallet. He put the stick between his teeth, pointed end forward. Patricia told him to take it out. He didn't. He walked 3 steps before his right foot caught a raised tile edge. His body pitched forward without warning, both hands still inside the bag. He struck the ground chin first. The force of the impact pushed the bamboo skewer up through the back of his mouth. The sharp, pointed end went through the soft roof of his mouth and into the back of his throat, about 3.5 inches deep. This tore some small arteries, causing severe bleeding from the back of the nose. The bottom part of the skewer hit his lower teeth and broke, leaving the upper part stuck inside his mouth, with only a broken tip visible from the outside. Craig did not lose consciousness. He came up to his hands and knees on the stone tiles. He could not fully close his mouth. Blood ran from his nose and dropped from his lips onto the pavement in a steady stream. A vendor from a nearby stall reached him first and called for help. Bystanders stabilized the skewer while Patricia arrived seconds later. Craig remained conscious but was unable to speak. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Ambulance access was impeded by the market's narrow vendor alleys and dense pedestrian flow. Responders arrived approximately 18 minutes later and transported Craig to a regional hospital. He was alert on arrival, but deteriorating. He died 4 hours later from progressive hemorrhagic shock secondary to posterior nasopharyngeal bleeding. The coroner's report detailed that he died from severe bleeding after a bamboo skewer pierced the back of his mouth and upper throat, cutting small arteries and causing massive bleeding from his nose and throat. His death was ruled an accident. Craig's family returned to Arizona within days. Patricia declined all media contact, and the family maintained complete privacy. The market authority updated pedestrian hazard signage in several high-traffic corridors the following year, adding raised yellow hazard markers and improved aisle clearance. The changes were described publicly as routine safety improvements, with no formal statement connecting them to the incident. It was May 18, 2016. A large Ferris wheel with sealed glass capsules carried passengers nearly 400 feet above a riverside amusement district in northern China. Lian Xiao, a 24-year-old junior accountant, was in capsule number 7 with 2 co-workers. Lian worked in accounts receivable at a mid-sized freight company, processing invoices and tracking shipments. Co-workers described her as meticulous with spreadsheets, but frequently ignoring surroundings while focused on getting the perfect shot on her phone. Over the past 3 months, she had become increasingly focused on documenting every weekend trip, restaurant visit, and scenic location with carefully composed photographs. The new phone represented 2 months of savings, and colleagues said that she treated it like professional equipment, often spending 20 minutes perfecting a single shot. This particular Ferris wheel's capsules have cushioned benches along the perimeter and a low central column with a small luggage shelf. Each capsule holds 8 passengers. The curved glass panels are secured by steel frames with upper and lower retaining clips, designed to withstand wind loads and passenger movement during the 30-minute rotation cycle. That afternoon, Leon grew frustrated trying to capture both herself and the skyline through the pod's curved glass and began searching for higher angles inside the capsule. The bench seating blocked optimal angles, and reflections ruined multiple attempts. Her co-workers sat on the benches, watching the view and occasionally glancing at Leon as she moved around the confined space. Another passenger, a businessman from Shanghai, later told investigators he watched Leon examine the central column and adjacent trim pieces, testing the edge of the bench and surrounding panel. As the capsule approached peak height at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Leon climbed onto the perimeter bench near the central column, a position clearly marked for seated use. Despite the businessman verbally warning her to sit down, she ignored him, standing unsteadily while holding her phone at arm's length. Needing more distance for a wider shot, she leaned her full weight backward against the glass wall, pressing her shoulders and upper back firmly against the panel while extending her arms forward. The glass panel had been installed during original construction 8 years earlier. Investigators later found the upper clip, a painted carbon steel fitting exposed to river spray and urban pollution, had extensive crevice corrosion and micro cracks that routine visual inspections had failed to detect. The panel's lower edge remained secured, but the top had developed microscopic movement. When Leon shifted her full 118 pounds against the upper portion, lateral pressure overwhelmed the weakened clip. Both co-workers and the businessman reported hearing a sharp cracking sound. The top edge of the glass panel separated from its frame and tilted outward, creating a widening gap. Leon's backward momentum carried her through the opening before she could react. Her body fell approximately 394 feet in roughly 5 seconds. The impact occurred at 2:17 in the afternoon. A tower camera focused on the wheel's rim showed the panel shift, and the operator monitoring that feed immediately initiated emergency stop protocols, halting the wheel's rotation within 40 seconds. The park's medical team reached the base structure in 6 minutes, but found Leon unresponsive with obvious fatal trauma. Municipal emergency services arrived in 14 minutes and officially pronounced death at the scene. The medical examiner's report documented massive blunt force trauma causing instant death from multiple catastrophic injuries. The observation wheel remained closed for 2 weeks while provincial safety inspectors examined all capsules, performed ultrasonic testing on all upper clips, and discovered corrosion in 11 other upper clips across different pods. The operating company faced lawsuits filed by Leon's family claiming negligent maintenance and inadequate safety inspections, and later settled out of court for undisclosed amounts.
It was January 23, 2018, and Minneapolis was locked in the kind of winter that makes the whole city feel smaller. Temperatures had been fluctuating for weeks, freezing, then briefly thawing, then freezing again. That cycle is exactly what makes ice unpredictable. And it's what had been happening at a small neighborhood pond on the city's south side. The surface looked solid from the bank, but the signage at the water's edge told a different story. Kelly Spuff was 39. She worked in office administration, structured, routine-driven, used to things making sense. People who knew her said she pushed back when she felt she was being told what to do unnecessarily. She had the day off and went out for a walk to clear her head after a frustrating week, needing to feel in control of something small. She wasn't reckless in the usual sense, but when challenged, she had a tendency to push, to prove the point instead of stepping back. She arrived at the pond already in that mindset, looking for space, not a confrontation. The thin ice signs were clearly posted. A man nearby with 2 young children noticed her approaching the edge and warned her directly. He told her the ice wasn't safe. She paused, just long enough to register it, then kept going, like the warning didn't apply to her, like it was something she could personally assess and dismiss. Near the shoreline, the ice was white and opaque, the kind that looks solid. Further out, darker patches showed where it was thinner. Those patches weren't subtle. The man called out again, louder. Witnesses said her steps changed, more deliberate. It stopped looking like a walk and started looking like a decision she didn't want to walk back from. I've covered enough of these cases to know that a sign and a verbal warning together almost never change the outcome. Kelly had both, and neither was enough. She stepped past the sign and onto the ice. The surface held near the edge. She moved farther out, stomping as she went, testing it or making a point. It wasn't cautious. The stomping had a rhythm, exaggerated like she was proving something to the people watching. The cracking sound carried back to the bank. By then, the man had stopped warning and started pleading, telling her to come back, that his kids were watching. She kept going anyway, adding just a few more steps that made all the difference. She made it about 15 to 20 feet out before the surface gave way. The water was several feet deep. Cold shock is immediate. Gasping, rapid breathing, loss of control. She reached for the edge, trying to pull herself out, but the ice kept breaking under her grip, pushing solid ground farther away. The man found a long branch and extended it toward her, but he couldn't reach without risking the ice himself. He stayed at the edge and kept trying. Within minutes, cold incapacitation set in. Strength dropped. Coordination failed. Her movement slowed. What stands out is how fast it turned, from control to panic, from proving a point to fighting for seconds. With no time left to correct it, she was conscious and trying for a period that felt long to the people watching, and there was nothing they could do. By the time emergency services arrived, she had gone under. Responders recovered her from the water. She was unresponsive. Efforts to revive her failed, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was cold water immersion, cold shock, incapacitation, then drowning. Investigators confirmed both signage and a direct warning had been present. The pond was temporarily closed. No changes to signage were recommended. It had been clear and correct. The warnings worked. They just weren't followed.
It was November 12, 2016, in Detroit, Michigan. The office building on Griswold Street was nearly empty by the time the cleaning shift ended, the hallways dimmed to half light, and the elevators standing idle. Martin Delgado, 44, had worked as a maintenance technician for a commercial cleaning contractor for 11 years. He was reliable and unhurried, the kind of worker supervisors rarely had cause to think about. He had covered the overnight shift at the building 3 times a week for the past 2 years and knew every floor, every corridor, and every machine in the place. His shift officially ended at 12:30 a.m. He was the last person on his crew to leave. The vending machine sat in the alcove beside the 3rd-floor break room, a full-size unit roughly 5 feet tall and weighing close to 400 pounds when stocked. It had been in the same position for years, its base resting directly on the tile floor without any restraint or wall bracket securing it. The glass front glowed faintly under the corridor lighting, 3 rows of snacks coiled behind it. Martin stopped in front of it on his way to the elevator. He fed coins into the slot and selected a chocolate bar from the middle row. The spiral coil turned. The bar shifted forward, tilted at the edge, and stopped. It sat wedged between the coil and the glass, visibly stuck, going nowhere. He pressed the selection button again. The coil turned a fraction and stopped. The bar did not move. He crouched and looked through the glass. The bar was close enough to see clearly, leaning at an angle against the inside of the panel. He stood, pressed the button a 3rd time, and got nothing. He tapped the side of the machine with his open palm. The bar shifted slightly but held its position. He paused, then he pushed forward again, putting his weight into it. The machine tipped forward past its balance point, the full mass of the unit shifting toward him. He had no time to move. The machine came down across his chest and pinned him to the floor with an impact that resonated through the empty corridor. The chocolate bar dislodged on impact and dropped cleanly into the collection tray below. A security guard completing a routine floor check discovered Martin pinned beneath the machine at approximately 1:10 a.m. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Fire department rescue personnel arrived and lifted the unit using equipment. Martin Delgado was transported to a hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as traumatic chest compression. Investigators documented the machine's position, confirmed it had not been anchored to the wall or floor, and noted the absence of any anti-tip restraint. Building management later removed the machine from the break room and required that any replacement units be installed with anti-tip brackets secured to the wall or floor. The chocolate bar Martin had paid for was recovered untouched from the collection tray at the base of the machine. It was March 12, 2018, on Route 17 northbound in Paramus, New Jersey. The The afternoon was clear and dry, as steady weekend traffic moved between shopping centers and highway entrances. Delivery trucks and dump trucks traveled through the corridor, while brake lights rippled across the lanes as vehicles slowed and accelerated through merging traffic. Monica Hale, 45, worked as a dental receptionist in Paramus. Co-workers described her as organized but quick to lose patience when schedules changed or people slowed things down. Much of her routine centered around her daily commute, and her sedan had a phone mounted to the windshield, where she sometimes recorded short clips of traffic while talking about drivers she believed were careless or aggressive. Friends later said Monica often complained that other vehicles were following too closely behind her. Even in normal traffic, she sometimes believed certain drivers were deliberately staying near her car. In the weeks before the crash, she had mentioned several trucks that she believed had followed her along different routes during her commute, suspicions that often appeared in the short videos she recorded from inside her vehicle. That afternoon, Monica drove northbound along Route 17, heading home after work. Traffic was moderately heavy as vehicles moved between retail exits and merging lanes near Paramus Road. A loaded dump truck carrying gravel entered the same lane behind her sedan after merging from a side road. Witnesses later said Monica began checking her rearview mirror repeatedly while pointing toward the truck behind her. At several points, she slowed sharply before accelerating again, forcing the truck driver to brake as traffic compressed around them. Drivers nearby reported seeing Monica gesturing in her mirror and shaking her head while looking back at the truck. Each time the sedan slowed, the dump truck driver reduced speed and attempted to increase distance. However, vehicles in the adjacent lanes limited how far the truck could move. Traffic beside the truck prevented it from shifting lanes while the flow of cars continued through the corridor. As the vehicles approached a slight bend near an overpass, Monica's sedan slowed again. Witnesses described her braking abruptly while looking back toward the truck behind her. The car's brake lights illuminated as its speed dropped quickly in front of the larger vehicle. The dump truck driver applied the brakes immediately. The truck's air braking system engaged as the heavy vehicle slowed under the weight of its gravel load. A loaded dump truck weighs several times more than a passenger car and requires significantly more distance to stop. With limited space ahead and no open lane to move into, the truck continued closing the remaining distance. The front bumper of the truck struck the rear of Monica's sedan. The impact pushed the smaller vehicle forward several yards before both vehicles came to a stop in the lane. The rear of the sedan collapsed inward as surrounding traffic slowed, and drivers steered around the crash. Emergency services arrived within minutes as police secured the roadway, and paramedics attempted life-saving measures, but Monica was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be blunt force injuries to the head, neck, and chest, consistent with a high-energy rear-end collision. Investigators documented skid marks, vehicle positions, and statements from drivers who witnessed the crash. Witnesses reported that the sedan had slowed suddenly several times before the collision. Investigators later concluded that repeated sudden braking in dense traffic contributed to the crash. The dump truck driver remained at the scene and cooperated with authorities, who determined he attempted to brake but did not have enough distance to stop the loaded vehicle. No charges were filed. It was June 22, 2016, on a high-rise construction site along Brickell Avenue in Miami, Florida, and the last joke Gareth Lomba ever attempted had no punchline, only the kind of ending that leaves men standing in silence, unable to look at one another. Gareth, 41, had spent 15 years working concrete and steel across South Florida. Originally from Orlando, he'd cycled through a dozen sites before settling into a long-term position with a mid-sized commercial contractor. Foreman knew him as someone who worked clean and cut tension with low-grade pranks, hard hat swaps, air hose inflation gags, the kind of mischief that made 12-hour shifts tolerable. He wasn't reckless by reputation. He was the guy who pushed the line just past where it should have been. His regular partner was Noel Aji, 36, a Haitian-born ironworker who had worked alongside Gareth for 2 years. Noel was methodical, the kind of man who double-checked torque specs without prompting. He pushed back on Gareth's antics quietly, but consistently, with little effect. Gareth had inflated his pants leg twice before using the pneumatic system powering the jackhammers at low pressure, both times to mild laughter. The first time, the fabric stretched slightly and made a soft, brief hissing sound. The second time, the expansion was marginally more noticeable, drawing a few quiet comments from nearby workers, but nothing more. Shortly after the noon break, he pressed the nozzle firmly against the seam of his work pants and held it there as the compressor continued running at full pressure. Noel told him it was too much. He said it again, more insistently, but Gareth did not stop. The nozzle remained sealed against the fabric as the compressor line continued to hiss. The fabric provided almost no resistance between the nozzle and his body. He focused the full pressure of the air onto a very small area. The hose remained steady in his hands, the air hissing continuously, and Gareth maintained the position without adjusting or wavering. He made no movement except to keep the nozzle in place as the compressor continued forcing air through the line. The pneumatic system powering the jackhammers ran through industrial-grade hoses, carrying up to 90 pounds per square inch of compressed air. At working pressure, that same force drives tools capable of breaking reinforced concrete. At maximum output, it can rupture sealed containers. With the nozzle tightly sealed against his body, the pressure had nowhere else to go. The air entered instantly. Gareth released a single high-pitched sound, brief and sharp, unlike anything Noel had ever described hearing before in his life. The sound cut through the space, startling in its intensity, resonating for a moment that felt longer than its actual duration. It lasted under 2 seconds. Then Gareth sat down onto the concrete, not suddenly, slowly, the way a person lowers themselves onto a chair they can't quite find. He didn't fall sideways, didn't grab anything. He simply descended and stopped moving, upright but motionless. Noel called emergency services within seconds. Paramedics arrived in approximately 9 minutes. Gareth was conscious but unresponsive to verbal questions when they reached him. He was transported to a regional trauma center and died 8 hours later without regaining coherent awareness. The coroner's summary detailed massive internal barotrauma from high-pressure air forced into the lower gastrointestinal tract, rupture of the colon and small intestine at multiple sites, severe internal hemorrhaging with no viable intervention window given the extent of damage, cause of death, traumatic rupture of abdominal organs consistent with acute pneumatic injury. A regional occupational safety agency conducted a formal investigation in the weeks that followed. The compressor hose was removed from service pending inspection, and the agency issued a summary warning to all local contractors about the dangers of misusing high-pressure equipment. Noel Ajay returned to the site after a period of counseling. He didn't speak publicly about what he'd witnessed. It was July 2nd, 2017. The concrete pathways at a regional water park in central Ohio were slick with chlorinated water and sunscreen residue as afternoon temperatures pushed past 92 degrees. Kevin Mardo, a 19-year-old from a suburb outside Columbus, stood in the queue for the park's main log flume attraction. Kevin had a documented history of ignoring posted safety rules during outings. Former teachers and part-time supervisors had previously noted repeated incidents involving him entering restricted areas and trying to bypass normal ride procedures rather than waiting his turn. One relative later told investigators Kevin had joked earlier that afternoon that he didn't need to wait in lines and could find quicker ways onto rides. Log flume rides feature gravity-driven water channels moving 400-pound fiberglass boats at 8 to 12 miles per hour through narrow guide rails with minimal clearance. Automated conveyors return empty boats. Riders must board from supervised platforms only. The 8 to 10-inch gap between hull and channel is wide enough for water, but too narrow for human limbs or torsos, depending on orientation. A service gate near the unloading zone had been propped open by maintenance staff addressing a minor drainage issue under an active work order that had not yet cleared the area for public exposure. 2 relatives later told investigators they called his name when they spotted him slipping through, with one stating he appeared to be trying to jump into a returning empty log instead of waiting at the loading platform. Neither physically pursued him or alerted staff immediately. The ride attendant stationed at dispatch was troubleshooting a boat that had stalled on the conveyor belt while operating alone at the control position. Kevin walked along the exit platform toward the return channel, where empty boats circled back toward the loading area. Surveillance footage from an overhead catwalk camera showed him crouching at the platform edge with his hands extended toward an approaching empty log, as if preparing to climb in mid-return. The platform's surface, constantly wet from splash and overflow, offered minimal traction. Park inspection records noted that non-slip coating in that section was due for resurfacing within 30 days, with a pending maintenance ticket logged but not yet scheduled. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Kevin attempted to jump into a passing empty log. His right foot slipped on the wet fiberglass edge. He fell backward into the water-filled trough, landing on his left side and rotating partially onto his back. The following log, weighing 400 pounds and traveling at 9 miles per hour, had already been dispatched into the return channel seconds earlier, after ride spacing tightened during the earlier conveyor delay. The current pushed Kevin sideways until his left shoulder and upper torso became pinned at an angle between the boat's bow and a protruding concrete guide flange. A maintenance worker on an overhead catwalk heard shouting and looked down to see Kevin's arms flailing above the waterline. He immediately radioed the control booth. The boat continued forward under water current and residual conveyor momentum. The emergency stop was triggered, but momentum carried the boat several feet further along the guide rail. Before deceleration fully halted movement, a second log that had already entered the zone advanced from behind, increasing pressure at the contact point. Kevin's movement stopped. Park rescue personnel, stationed at the first aid building 200 yards away, were notified at and reached the scene in approximately 5 minutes. Responders secured electrical lockout procedures and manually winched both boats backward, using ride rescue equipment to access Kevin. He showed no pulse and displayed massive crush injuries to his chest and abdomen when extracted. The county medical examiner determined death resulted from traumatic asphyxiation and internal hemorrhaging. The family filed wrongful death litigation against the park operator, citing inadequate gate security and delayed emergency response. The case settled for an undisclosed sum 18 months later. It was August 14, 2018, at a private residence in Arizona. The evening was warm. The house belonged to a collector who kept exotic reptiles as a hobby, multiple species housed in secured enclosures in a dedicated room. The enclosures were labeled. The handling rules were posted on the wall inside the door. Visitors were briefed before entering. Marcus Ellison was 34 and worked as a sales representative for a mid-sized consumer goods company. He was known among his social circle as outgoing, impulsive, and quick to dismiss warnings he did not personally find credible. He had no background with reptiles and no prior experience handling venomous snakes. He had arrived at the residence that evening as part of a casual visit before a planned night out. He had not come to see the snakes specifically. The room was simply part of the tour. I've seen that shift before. Someone introduces something dangerous and someone else pushes too far. I understand the dynamic. I've just never seen it end like this. Before entering, the owner gave a clear and direct briefing. Do not touch anything. Do not open any enclosure. The Cobra in particular was pointed out by name and location. The owner explained that the animal was fast, defensive, and unpredictable under stress, that it did not need to display aggression before striking. Marcus acknowledged the warning. He did not ask any follow-up questions. He followed the owner into the room. The enclosures lined 3 walls. The Cobra was visible in its enclosure from the doorway, coiled, head slightly elevated, body held in a loose S-curve. Marcus positioned himself in front of it and watched it. The animal did not move. He interpreted this as an indication that the animal was settled. The owner stepped out of the room briefly to attend to something in the adjacent space, and this is where it starts. Marcus moved closer to the enclosure. He opened it. He reached in and made contact with the snake, patting it once on the body. The strike was immediate, faster than he could fully process the movement. A single bite to the right hand. He pulled back and the snake recoiled into its enclosure. He closed the enclosure, and this is the part I find hardest to process. After everything that just happened, his first instinct was to close the enclosure. Neat, tidy, like it had not just happened. He said nothing, treating it as minor, not something that required interruption or explanation. He remained in the room until the owner returned, gave no indication that anything had occurred, and left the residence shortly after as planned. The owner had no knowledge of the bite at the time of departure. Marcus arrived at the bar where his friends were already gathered. He mentioned nothing about the snake room beyond a passing comment that the collection was interesting. He ordered a drink. The puncture marks on his right hand were visible, with slight swelling already forming around them. He appeared otherwise normal for the first 30 minutes. What gets me about that is someone at that bar could see the puncture marks. The swelling was already forming, and he ordered a drink. Within the hour, his eyelids began to droop. He blinked repeatedly, visibly working to focus. He told the group he felt a little off but laughed as he said it. No one called for help at that point. Over the following hour, his speech began to slur. His coordination dropped noticeably. He had difficulty holding his glass. Friends began to recognize that something was wrong. The shift from minor complaint to visible incapacitation had happened gradually enough that no single moment had prompted immediate action, and I genuinely can't help but wonder what he was thinking when all this was happening, because he clearly knew he was losing it. Emergency services were contacted when Marcus became unable to hold himself upright in his seat. Paramedics arrived and began assessment immediately. His right hand showed paired puncture marks consistent with a venomous snake bite. His breathing was shallow and labored, and he was becoming unresponsive to verbal commands. They stabilized him for transport and moved him to the nearest hospital as quickly as possible. Antivenom was administered on arrival, but the delay from the point of the bite to treatment had significantly reduced the chances of successful reversal. Marcus Ellison was pronounced dead not long after arrival. The cause of death was recorded as respiratory failure resulting from neurotoxic envenomation. Investigators discovered that the enclosure had been opened without authorization while the owner was out of the room. The owner had no knowledge the bite had occurred until contacted by investigators. Marcus had left the residence without disclosing the incident and had sought no medical treatment at any point following the bite. The enclosure was found properly closed. Marcus had shut it after the strike. And the part that stays with me about Marcus Ellison is that antivenom existed. The treatment was available. Every minute he spent at that bar was a minute that treatment was not happening. He made a choice not to say anything, and that choice is what killed him. It was September 14th, 2016, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the busy commercial corridor in suburban Tulsa, Oklahoma. The four-lane road hummed with steady traffic as shoppers moved between strip malls and office buildings. Dana Quist, a 42-year-old office supervisor, had just finished her lunch break at the small administrative building where she managed clerical staff. Known among co-workers for her strong opinions about government regulations, Dana often voiced her belief that many public safety rules were unnecessary interference. She frequently lectured co-workers about how seatbelt laws were pointless government control and insisted experienced drivers like her didn't need them. She took pride in her independent streak and frequently lectured others about how policies should operate. Her compact sedan sat in the parking lot as two younger employees approached, accepting her offer for a ride to a nearby restaurant. As the three women settled into the car, one passenger suggested everyone buckle their seatbelts before heading onto the busy road. Dana dismissed the suggestion with a wave, explaining that seatbelt laws represented government overreach and that she preferred to drive without such restrictions. She even mocked people who followed those rules, describing them as people who blindly trusted government instructions. She had never been in a serious accident and considered herself an experienced driver who didn't need artificial safety measures. The two passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but quietly fastened their own belts as Dana started the engine. The sedan pulled onto the commercial road, joining vehicles moving at the posted 45-mile-per-hour speed limit. Shopping plaza entrances dotted the route, creating frequent opportunities for vehicles to enter and exit. Dana maintained a steady pace of around 40 miles per hour as they passed several intersections, chatting casually about weekend plans. Traffic moved smoothly until they approached a signalized intersection where several businesses clustered around the corners. The light ahead showed green as Dana continued forward, maintaining her speed. Without warning, a pickup truck emerged from a parking lot driveway directly in front of Dana's sedan. The truck's driver had apparently misjudged the gap in traffic. Dana immediately pressed the brake pedal hard, her tires squealing against the asphalt. Investigators later documented long skid marks across the asphalt, showing she had tried to brake hard before the collision. Despite her quick reaction, sedan struck the pickup's rear quarter panel with significant force. The impact created a loud crash that echoed across the intersection. The sudden deceleration threw Dana's unrestrained body forward with tremendous force, while her passengers, secured by seatbelts, remained relatively stable in their seats. Her unrestrained body surged forward, striking the steering wheel before her head continued into the windshield. As the vehicle jolted to a stop, the airbag deployed with a sharp pop, but without a seatbelt to restrain her movement. Her body surged forward faster than the airbag alone could control. Without this critical safety device, the violent impact drove her into the steering wheel before her head struck the windshield, creating an extensive spiderweb fracture pattern across the glass. The vehicle rolled to a stop in the intersection, with Dana slumped unconscious over the steering wheel. Witnesses immediately called emergency services. The two passengers, though shaken and suffering minor bruises from their seatbelts, were able to speak coherently with first responders. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and found Dana unconscious with severe head trauma. They extracted her from the wreckage and transported her to a nearby trauma center. Despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival due to traumatic brain injuries sustained during the steering wheel and windshield impact caused by the lack of a seatbelt restraint. The crash investigation team documented the scene, measuring skid marks and interviewing witnesses. They noted the absence of seatbelt use as a major contributing factor. It was August 19, 2017, in Chicago, Illinois. The night was humid and still, and the city below the 12th floor was quiet, except for the low movement of late traffic along the street. Marcus Holt, 34, worked as a regional sales representative for a medical supply company. Renee Holt, 31, had worked as a dental hygienist before taking time away following a difficult pregnancy, and had recently returned to part-time work at a clinic in Lincoln Park. The two had been married for 4 years and lived together in a 12-story residential building in Chicago. Neighbors later described the couple as generally quiet, though arguments inside the apartment had occasionally been heard in the past. Their unit included a small exterior balcony overlooking the street. The balcony railing stood approximately 4 feet high. Below it, a bundle of utility service cables ran along the exterior of the building between the 8th and 9th floors, supporting communication and service lines connected to the surrounding block. The argument began inside the apartment sometime after 11 in the evening. It escalated quickly and continued for roughly 30 minutes before the couple moved outside onto the balcony. 12 stories below them, the street was visible through the railing. Neither slowed down. The argument intensified. Marcus shoved Renee with both hands. She stumbled backward into the railing, her upper body tipping over before she could recover, and she went over the edge. A bundle of utility service cables mounted along the exterior of the building caught her partway down. The lines sagged sharply under her weight, leaving her tangled and suspended several floors above the street. She was conscious and calling out, but unable to free herself. Marcus looked over the railing and saw her suspended several floors below. The cables had stopped her fall between the 8th and 9th floors. From where he stood on the 12th floor balcony, she was still several stories beneath him. At that point, emergency services could have been contacted for a rescue from below. Instead, Marcus climbed over the railing of the 12th floor balcony, with no harness, no rope, no anchor point, and no equipment of any kind. Holding the outer ledge of the balcony, he attempted to lower himself down the exterior wall of the building toward the cables several floors below where Renee was tangled. He lost his grip almost immediately. Marcus fell past the cables without catching them and dropped the full remaining distance to the pavement below the building. Residents on a 9th floor balcony heard Renee calling out and came outside. The cables ran close enough to the building that they were able to reach her and pull her through the railing to safety before emergency services arrived. She was conscious when paramedics reached her and was transported to a hospital, where she was treated for a broken collarbone, lacerations to both arms, and injuries to her right leg. She was admitted in stable condition. Marcus Holt was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was blunt force trauma resulting from a fall from height. Investigators reviewed the physical evidence and determined that Marcus had pushed Renee over the railing before attempting to climb down the exterior of the building to reach her. No charges were filed against Renee. She survived the incident and later provided a statement to authorities about the events on the balcony. It was August 6, 2013, on Interstate 80 westbound near Vacaville, California. Afternoon rush traffic filled the highway as cars and freight trucks crept forward through dense congestion. Along the right edge of the road, a narrow shoulder ran beside the lane, marked clearly for emergency use only. Heather Lawson, 46, worked as a medical billing clerk and followed the same highway commute home nearly every weekday. Co-workers described her as organized at work, but easily irritated outside the office, especially during her drive home through crowded traffic. Public records showed several speeding citations over the previous decade. Friends later said she often complained about other drivers and believed people on the road slowed her down on purpose. That afternoon, Heather stopped at a fast food drive-thru before leaving the shopping area near Vacaville. As she pulled onto the highway and opened the bag at a red light, she noticed her burger came with only one small ketchup packet. Witnesses later recalled seeing her throw the bag onto the passenger seat while gesturing in frustration as traffic ahead slowed. By the time she merged onto Interstate 80, rush hour congestion had already formed. Vehicles moved only a few car lengths at a time before stopping again. Drivers waited patiently as the line crept forward, but Heather repeatedly closed gaps between cars and sounded her horn. Witnesses later said Heather began weaving within her lane while searching for a way around the traffic ahead. When vehicles slowed again near the Cherry Glen Road area, she steered onto the narrow shoulder despite signs clearly stating it was for emergencies only. Dust lifted from the gravel as her sedan accelerated quickly along the shoulder, passing rows of slow-moving vehicles while traffic in the travel lanes barely moved. About half a mile ahead, a highway patrol officer had stopped on the shoulder to assist another vehicle. When he saw the sedan approaching rapidly along the emergency lane, the officer stood beside his patrol car and signaled for the driver to stop. Heather slowed briefly and pulled alongside the patrol car. Witnesses later told investigators that she leaned toward the officer and said she needed to get through because she was pregnant and feeling sick. As the officer stepped toward the driver's window from beside the patrol car, Heather suddenly accelerated and continued driving along the shoulder. The officer returned to his patrol car and activated his lights and siren while traffic ahead remained heavy, leaving little space for vehicles to merge between lanes. After several seconds on the shoulder, Heather tried forcing her way back into the right lane between two cars creeping forward in slow traffic. Her tires struck the loose gravel beyond the shoulder line, causing the sedan to lose traction and slide sideways across the lane. Drivers braked sharply as the car spun across two lanes of traffic, striking the metal guardrail before rebounding across the roadway and slamming into the concrete median barrier, where the airbags deployed and the vehicle came to a stop. Emergency services were called immediately as traffic slowed around the crash site. Medical personnel attempted resuscitation on the roadway, but were unable to restore circulation. The coroner later determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head and chest from the high-speed impacts. Investigators documented tire marks along the shoulder and gravel scuffs where traction had failed. Witnesses confirmed the sedan had driven along the emergency lane before the crash. It was January 19, 2015, and the Shotover River Gorge outside Queenstown, New Zealand was running fast and loud, its green water churning between walls of wet schist that had been swallowing the careless long before anyone bothered to post signs about it. Finn Abernethy was 24 and worked in outdoor recreation logistics out of Dunedin, coordinating gear shipments and bookings for a regional adventure company. He knew the industry from the operational side, which gave him a particular disdain for paying tourist prices on experiences he thought he could access himself. Friends described him as resourceful, competent, and reliably resistant to advice he hadn't asked for. He had driven to Queenstown for a long weekend, carrying no firm itinerary. He had no intention of booking the jet boat tour, which cost nearly $200. Instead, he decided to scramble down a slick moss-covered ledge along the canyon wall to get a better view of the river below. A friend, reached by phone while Finn was already descending toward the gorge, urged him to turn back, but he shrugged off the concern, convinced he could manage the terrain. The ledge system was narrow, coated with lichen from days of rain, and the drop to the boulder field at the gorge margin measured roughly 26 feet. Finn settled onto a precarious shelf to watch the commercial boats pass below, fully aware that one misstep could be disastrous. The Shotover Gorge is a narrow, technically demanding canyon. Jet boats run the Narrows at up to 55 miles per hour, threading passages barely wider than their hulls. The exposed rock shelves offered almost no grip when wet. Finn's choice to sit on such a ledge, unroped and unsupervised, was a clear departure from any standard safety practice. A commercial boat came through that afternoon with passengers aboard. A couple at the bow spotted Finn on the ledge and pointed him out. The guide radioed the dock. Warning signs were posted at every gorge access point. Finn was visible, stationary, and ignoring every posted and verbal warning. 4 minutes after the boat moved out of sight, the same couple, watching from downstream, saw him fall. His feet gave way on the wet surface. He did not catch himself. He went over the edge feet first but rotating, with 26 feet of open air between him and a fractured field of boulders. His body struck the rocks at an angle, right side first. The impact shattered his hip and shoulder simultaneously. The force folded him forward, and his skull connected with the edge of a large stone, hard enough to cause severe head trauma. He came to rest in a partially submerged position at the gorge margin, face down, one arm bent the wrong direction, unmoving. The couple reported the fall to the guide immediately. Accessing the site required jet boat approach from the water side and helicopter support from above. The helicopter required multiple approaches because of narrow wind turbulence conditions and lift angle constraints inside the canyon. The combined operation took 6 hours. Water in the gorge complicated extraction from below. The coroner's report identified blunt force trauma consistent with a fall onto irregular rock. Fractures were recorded to the skull, right clavicle, right pelvis, and 4 ribs. Death was attributed to traumatic brain injury sustained on impact. No evidence of a medical episode prior to the fall was found. A local newspaper briefly reported on the rescue operation, and Finn's name was initially withheld. In the months that followed, the jet boat operator updated its safety signage and added a verbal warning about the dangers of climbing onto the gorge ledges. It was January 21st, 2018. The morning sun beat down on a water park on Australia's Gold Coast, where families lined up for slides and wave pools under cloudless skies. Martin Vale stood in line for the park's fastest water slide with 3 friends from his old club. Martin, 50, had spent 15 years playing semi-professional rugby for a coastal league team before retiring at 38 due to recurring knee injuries. His teammates remembered him as physically imposing and stubborn, someone who refused to tap out during training no matter how exhausted. Water slides operate on simple physics. Gravity accelerates riders down angled chutes, while water reduces friction, with speed controlled by slide angle and rider position. Park regulations required all riders to go feet first to prevent head and neck injuries, with multiple signs posted at every slide entrance. The 200-foot slide Martin was queuing for reached speeds of approximately 38 miles per hour, ending in a shallow run-out trough designed to slow riders before they reached the catch pool. That afternoon, Martin and his friends had been drinking beer since noon at the poolside bar. By 2:15 in the afternoon, they reached the slide platform. Martin loudly announced to his group that he would go head first like he had done at smaller slides earlier that day, ignoring the prominent feet first only signs posted at eye level. The teenage attendant attempted to stop Martin, but he ignored the instruction entirely, stepping into the lane before the attendant could intervene further. Platform CCTV later showed Martin move into the lane, and ride sensor logs confirmed a momentary fault in the dispatch interlock that day. Martin positioned himself head first at the slide entrance, arms extended forward like a swimmer. Without waiting for the attendant's clearance signal, he pushed off forcefully, launching himself into the enclosed tube. His friends later told investigators they assumed the attendant had approved the launch. Martin accelerated rapidly down the steep sections, water pressure forcing his head lower as he picked up speed. Entering the run-out trough at approximately 38 miles per hour, his streamlined position prevented the natural slowdown that other riders experienced. His low head position caused his forehead to strike the fiberglass floor of the trough during deceleration, forcing his neck into a sudden forward compression. The impact stopped his forward head momentum, but his 220-pound body continued sliding forward, driving his face along the trough bottom for another 15 feet. Witnesses in the catch pool area saw Martin's body slide face down into the shallow water, arms floating limply at his sides. He made no attempt to lift his head or roll over. Water entered his mouth and nose as he floated motionless in 3 feet of water. The lifeguard reached him within 20 seconds, held his head and neck rigid while rolling him supine onto a rescue board, began rescue breathing and chest compressions, and had a defibrillator on scene within a minute. Martin showed no voluntary respiratory effort. He showed no visible response as rescuers continued emergency care. The lifeguard radioed for emergency services while continuing rescue protocols. He was transported to a regional hospital, where imaging revealed catastrophic brainstem injury from the initial impact and secondary hypoxic brain damage from water aspiration and oxygen deprivation. Martin remained on life support for 14 days, while physicians conducted multiple neurological assessments. All tests showed complete absence of brain activity. His family authorized withdrawal of mechanical ventilation on February 4, 2018. The coroner listed cause of death as severe hypoxic brain injury, secondary to blunt force head trauma and drowning. The water park temporarily closed the slide for investigation. Investigators reviewed CCTV footage, sensor logs, and bar service records. Ride attendants underwent mandatory retraining, emphasizing strict enforcement of dispatch procedures, rider positioning rules, and alcohol policies. It was the 22nd of April 2016 on a commuter rail line in suburban New Jersey. By 6:30, regular commuter traffic had already started moving through the station. Warning signs were posted at the platform edges. A pedestrian overpass sat 40 meters away, clearly marked and intended for pedestrians. Evan Callahan was 32 and had worked as a logistics coordinator at a mid-size freight company for 6 years. His role was built around safety compliance. He reviewed procedures, assessed risk, and signed off on what was acceptable and what was not. He had a documented pattern of marking standard safety checks as optional during high-volume periods, a practice his supervisors had flagged more than once. 8 months before the incident, a warehouse worker on his team fractured his wrist after skipping an equipment check that Callahan had marked as optional during a busy shift. The company opened a formal review. He was reprimanded and placed on a performance plan. He resigned 3 weeks later before the process concluded, and this is where it starts to get uncomfortable. He subsequently applied for a senior safety compliance officer position at a larger firm across the city. The role involved writing and enforcing safety policy at an organizational level. His closest friend had confirmed the application made sense, that Callahan was the kind of person suited for that seat. A reference letter submitted with his application described him as efficient, decisive, and not the type to let procedure slow down operations. And I genuinely did not know what to do with that line when I read it. Not the type to let procedure slow down operations. In a reference letter, for a safety compliance role. The interview was scheduled for 8:15 that morning. He woke up 40 minutes later than planned. He moved through the apartment quickly, showered, and pulled on a new suit collected from the dry cleaner the previous afternoon. The dry cleaning tag was still attached to the left sleeve when he left. He skipped breakfast and checked his phone repeatedly on the way out. He arrived at the station shortly before the next inbound service. The pedestrian overpass was visible from his position at the station entrance, clearly signed and a short walk from where he stood. He did not move toward it. He approached the tracks directly at a point where the fencing was designed to guide pedestrians toward the overpass. A gap was present in the fencing at that location, worn open through repeated use by commuters cutting across at the same point over an extended period. He passed through the gap without stopping and stepped onto the rail corridor. He scanned the near line. A train was visible approximately 200 meters out, approaching the station. He stepped over the first track and continued moving forward onto the second. He glanced in the direction of the adjacent line but did not stop or wait before placing his foot on the rail. The second train was approaching from the opposite direction on the adjacent track at full operational speed. It had been outside his line of sight from the angle at which he had looked. He had not verified the adjacent line was clear before stepping onto it, and this is the part I find hardest to sit with. He checked. He looked. He just did not stop long enough to actually see. The horn sounded when he was still in motion between the tracks. He turned toward the sound. The second train reached him before he could clear the track. The front of the train struck him directly on his left side, the point of contact covering his shoulder, ribcage, and hip simultaneously. His body was displaced laterally and forward, landing face down several meters from the point of contact. The force of the collision drove fractured rib segments into the left lung. Paramedics were dispatched immediately. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as massive blunt force trauma to the chest, abdomen, and head, consistent with a high-speed rail impact. Investigators confirmed the following. A designated pedestrian crossing was available and clearly marked a short walk from the point where Callahan crossed the tracks. He had not used it. He had observed one train on one line and had not properly verified the adjacent line before stepping onto it. The gap in the fencing through which he passed had been reported to the rail authority on 2 prior occasions and had not been repaired at the time of the incident. The dry cleaning tag was still attached to his sleeve when he was found. As tragic as this is, the irony is hard to miss that he applied for a senior safety compliance officer position, but he couldn't keep himself safe. Marcus Ellison's story is the last one in this video, and I want to be upfront. When I first read it, I almost did not believe it was real, not because of the snake, because of what he did after.
It was May 15th, 2018. And a quiet, residential community built over volcanic terrain was coming apart in a way no one there had ever experienced. Streets had begun to split. Long cracks cut through yards and pavement. In multiple locations, molten rock had already surfaced, slow but unstoppable. The air carried a sharp sulfur sting, the kind that burned the throat and made breathing feel wrong if you stayed in it too long. What started as warnings had escalated into mandatory evacuation orders. Families packed quickly, cars filled driveways, then disappeared. Within days, the neighborhood emptied out. Zabby Grohl, 61, did not leave. At first, neighbors assumed she just needed more time, but as conditions worsened, her refusal started to stand out. When utility crews came through urging immediate evacuation, she didn't just decline, she pushed back. When officials explained the severity, she reportedly insisted she understood the risks better than they did. She framed it as control, as awareness, as being more capable than the people knocking on her door. She wasn't panicking like everyone else. She wasn't overreacting. This was her property, and she made it clear she wasn't going to be told what to do with it. By the time the last neighbors were leaving, some described a shift, not just attachment, but defiance. She was still outside, moving things around, monitoring the situation herself, acting as if the evacuation was optional guidance meant for other people. The same warnings everyone else heard, she filtered differently. In her mind, this wasn't an emergency she needed to obey. It was an inconvenience she intended to outlast. The ground had been changing for days. Cracks widened across roads and yards. Gas levels fluctuated. The smell in the air wasn't constant. Sometimes it faded just enough to feel manageable, reinforcing the idea that the situation was under control. She continued working outside in that environment, adjusting belongings, staying active, staying present, as if visibility meant safety. Then a new fissure opened nearby. With it came a surge in volcanic gas output, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide pushing up from underground. The terrain wasn't flat or predictable. It dipped, pocketed, and uneven lava formations created natural low points where gases could settle. Carbon dioxide, heavier than air, collected silently in these areas, displacing oxygen without warning. Sulfur dioxide lingered as an irritant, burning, choking, forcing the body into distress. There isn't always smoke. There isn't always a visible cue, and by the time symptoms start, the body is already losing the ability to respond. She was outside when conditions shifted. Exposure at that level doesn't unfold slowly. Carbon dioxide reduces available oxygen, leading to dizziness, confusion, then rapid loss of consciousness. At the same time, sulfur dioxide inflames the lungs, triggering coughing, panic, and impaired breathing. Together, they create a narrowing window, seconds to minutes, where awareness slips before a person fully processes what's happening. There were no witnesses. What investigators later reconstructed came from position, gas measurements, and eruption timelines. She collapsed on her own property. What stays with me isn't just that she stayed, it's how firmly she believed she was the exception. The orders were clear, the risk was visible. People had already proven what the right decision looked like by leaving. But somewhere in that progression, she placed her judgment above all of it. Above officials, above neighbors, above the environment itself. By the time responders could safely return, she was unresponsive. She was found where she had chosen to remain. The cause of death was hazardous gas exposure, oxygen displacement from carbon dioxide accumulating in a low-lying area, compounded by respiratory distress from sulfur dioxide during active fissure emissions. The evacuation order had been documented. The advisories had been repeated. The conditions had been escalating in plain sight, and still, she stayed. Zabby's case changes the way the pattern reads. Every danger before this feels external, something advancing, something you can step away from. But here, the threat didn't need to chase her. It didn't need speed or force. It only required one decision to stand still and believe the rules didn't apply. That's what makes it different. Because the most dangerous factor in that entire environment wasn't just the gas rising from the ground. It was the certainty that she didn't have to listen. Zabby's story is the one that made me understand the question differently.
It was March 3, 2017, and the late afternoon air in Dayton, Ohio carried the crisp scent of early spring as customers moved in and out of the small retail plaza. The strip mall housed several businesses, including a hair salon that had been serving the local community for over a decade. Fluorescent lights illuminated the interior where styling chairs lined one wall. Mary Bratt, a 47-year-old retail clerk, had just finished her shift at a nearby clothing store within the same plaza. Known among her co-workers for her assertive personality and strong opinions about customer rights, Mary often challenged policies she disagreed with. She believed her experience as a paying customer gave her certain privileges. With plans to meet family for dinner, she decided to get a quick haircut. Mary entered the salon and approached the reception desk, requesting a last-minute appointment. The stylist explained there would be a short wait. Mary nodded and stepped outside, returning minutes later with a lit cigarette between her fingers. The scent of tobacco smoke immediately filled the small space. Staff members quickly noticed the cigarette and pointed to a clearly posted no smoking sign near the entrance. The salon had maintained this policy for years due to flammable hair products and close quarters. Mary responded with visible frustration, arguing loudly that as a paying customer she should have the right to smoke while waiting. Her voice grew louder as she insisted the policy was unreasonable. The stylist attempted to explain the safety concerns, particularly given the alcohol-based hair products and aerosol styling sprays used throughout the salon. Several bottles of hairspray, styling gel, and chemical treatments sat on the counter near the styling stations. Nearby sat a small trash bin used by stylists to discard paper towels and wipes after applying various products. While continuing her heated argument with the staff, Mary remained standing beside the main styling counter where several bottles of alcohol-based products had been used during recent appointments. The trash bin beside the station contained crumpled paper towels damp with styling chemicals and residue from aerosol sprays used throughout the afternoon. She gestured emphatically with the cigarette still burning between her fingers, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about the potential hazards surrounding her. During her confrontation, a small ember broke loose from the burning cigarette and fell into the open trash bin beside the station. Inside were paper towels lightly soaked with styling solutions and coated with residue from aerosol hairspray. Within seconds, the ember ignited the paper towels and chemical residue inside the bin. A sudden flash of flame burst upward from the bin as trapped chemical fumes caught fire. The flames quickly spread to the nearby counter, where plastic bottles and additional towels were positioned. Mary stepped backward instinctively as the flames erupted, but her sleeve caught fire as she moved away from the burning station. The synthetic fabric of her clothing ignited quickly, spreading flames up her arm. Employees immediately grabbed a fire extinguisher while another worker called emergency services. A staff member discharged the extinguisher toward the growing flames while attempting to smother the fire spreading along the station. Despite their quick response, the fire had already spread across 2 styling areas. Firefighters arrived within minutes and extinguished the interior blaze, but significant damage had occurred to the styling area. Mary was transported to a regional burn center with severe burn injuries covering her upper body. She later died from complications related to the extensive burns. Fire investigators examined the scene, collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses. Their analysis determined that the ignition involved a cigarette ember falling into a trash bin containing paper towels contaminated with hair styling chemicals and aerosol residue, igniting the material inside the bin. It was March 3, 2015 in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. The chocolate manufacturing plant ran production through the evening shift without interruption, the building warm and loud against the cold outside. Raymond Ost, 49, had worked on the production floor for 11 years. He knew the facility better than almost anyone on the evening shift. Supervisors trusted him to complete equipment checks alone without needing to report back at every station. That night, he had been assigned a routine walkthrough covering several machines across the floor, including the large mixing tank positioned near the center of the facility. The tank held several thousand pounds of heated liquid chocolate and fed multiple production lines simultaneously. A raised steel inspection platform sat above it, roughly 6 feet off the ground, reached by a short flight of metal steps. Built into the heavy sealed lid was a large maintenance access hatch, wide enough for a person to fall through, kept locked during normal production. A hinged guardrail section beside the hatch could be opened to give technicians closer access to the lid during servicing. Earlier in the shift, operators had noticed the chocolate mixture thickening around the mixing shaft. Maintenance technicians had inspected the tank, examined the shaft from above, and returned the equipment to production. When they finished, the hatch was left unsecured and the guardrail section was left open. Neither had been properly reset before the line resumed. Raymond reached the mixing tank during his walkthrough and climbed the metal steps to the platform. The open hatch and the open guardrail section were immediately visible. The correct procedure at that point was straightforward. Report the unsecured equipment to a supervisor, have the line paused, and wait for the hatch to be properly closed before conducting any check. A sign mounted on the platform clearly stated that the hatch was not to be approached during production without 2 personnel present, and the agitator fully locked out. Raymond did not call it in. He did not wait for a supervisor. He did not request a second person. He decided to conduct the check himself. Warm vapor rising from the heated chocolate below had left condensation across sections of the metal grating underfoot. He approached the open hatch alone and leaned forward over the unsecured opening to look down into the tank. Several feet below, the agitator turned slowly through the thick liquid. He shifted his footing on the damp grating to get a better angle. His foot slipped. With the guardrail beside the hatch still open and no second person present to catch him, there was nothing between him and the opening. He fell through the maintenance access hatch into the tank below. The agitator continued turning. Production across the rest of the facility continued without interruption. The surrounding machinery produced constant noise across the floor. No one witnessed the fall, and nothing on the production floor indicated anything had changed. As the shift progressed, supervisors assumed Raymond had moved further along his inspection route. After nearly an hour without contact, they began attempting to reach him by radio. When repeated calls went unanswered, a search of the production floor was organized. Workers checked each station along his assigned route one by one. Every location came up empty. When no one could account for his whereabouts, attention turned to the mixing tank. The tank was shut down and the lid opened. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Fire department rescue personnel and paramedics recovered Raymond from inside the tank. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as drowning after immersion in an industrial liquid. Investigators cited several contributing failures, including the maintenance override left active, the hatch left open, the guardrail left unsecured, and the lockout procedures that had not been completed before production resumed. Following the investigation, the facility installed additional safety interlocks on the tank hatch and revised its lockout procedures to require supervisory confirmation before the equipment could be restarted. It was October 22, 2014, in Phoenix, Arizona, at Bell Road and 7th Avenue. Evening rush stacked cars across wide lanes. West sun leveled through windshields. Lights cycled long. An air horn sounded from somewhere back. A hatch clicked open as a driver stepped into the intersection where cross-traffic would soon begin moving. Tracy Nolan, 49, worked as a warehouse inventory clerk in Phoenix. Co-workers described her as organized but impatient, especially during her daily commute through the city's busy roads. After a vehicle break-in the previous year, she began keeping an aluminum baseball bat in the cargo area of her SUV for protection when parking at shopping centers at night. That evening, she was driving north along Bell Road toward the intersection at 7th Avenue on her way home from work. Traffic slowed as cars queued at the red light. A silver sedan merged into the lane beside her, and witnesses later said Tracy immediately began gesturing through her window and pointing toward the other driver as the vehicles rolled to a stop. Both vehicles stopped near the front of the intersection. Drivers behind them began honking as the exchange continued while the signal held. Witnesses said Tracy leaned out of her window, continuing to gesture toward the sedan while traffic stacked up behind the light. Tracy then stepped out of her SUV, walked to the rear, and opened the hatch. She reached inside and pulled out the bat. Holding it at her side, she walked into the center of the intersection while continuing to confront the driver of the silver sedan, even as the signal phases were about to change and cross-traffic prepared to move. As the signal phase changed, the cross street received a green light and traffic began moving through the intersection. Vehicles traveling southbound entered the intersection with the right-of-way. Witnesses said Tracy continued walking diagonally through the intersection toward the sedan while holding the bat at her side. Her attention remained fixed on the other driver. A pickup truck entered the intersection from the cross street as traffic began moving. The driver braked when he saw Tracy step into the lane, but the distance was short and the truck had already begun accelerating from the stop line. The front of the truck struck Tracy on the left side of her body. The impact carried her onto the hood, where her upper body hit near the base of the windshield. The bat slipped from her hand and slid across the pavement. The truck stopped a short distance later. Tracy fell from the hood onto the roadway in front of the vehicle and did not move. Witnesses stepped back from the lane while emergency services were called immediately. Traffic slowed around the intersection as drivers waited for responders to arrive. Fire and medical crews reached the scene within minutes and began emergency care. Despite resuscitation efforts, Tracy was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported the cause of death as blunt force trauma from the collision with the vehicle. Injuries included severe head trauma and multiple fractures consistent with a pedestrian impact. Investigators measured vehicle positions, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed the timing of the traffic signals. The findings determined the pickup truck entered the intersection during its green phase and that Tracy had stepped into active traffic while confronting the other driver. After the investigation concluded and debris was cleared, the intersection reopened to traffic later that evening. It was April 10, 2017. Victoria Station, London was moving at its usual morning pace. Thousands of passengers cycling through tunnels and platforms, unaware that a routine argument between two people from Essex was about to end with one of them dead. Raymond Chalk, 58, spent 31 years as a mechanical engineer in industrial maintenance before retiring. He and his wife Elaine made regular trips into central London. They had frequent arguments, sometimes daily, and often extended for hours. Friends who knew the couple said they would bicker in the car, over breakfast, or while watching television, sometimes stopping only when one of them stormed out or snapped at a minor inconvenience. Neighbors reported hearing sharp exchanges through walls, voices rising and falling. Raymond often stubborn, Elaine insistent, each unwilling to concede. These arguments were routine, a persistent friction that defined much of their domestic life. Multiple noise complaints had been filed over the years, and welfare checks had been conducted. Elaine told investigators the arguments were never violent. They were about small things, routes, meals, small things. That morning it was the District or Circle line from Victoria. Raymond favored the Circle. Elaine disagreed. She said that the argument had started in the car, continued through the ticket hall, and was still going when they reached the platform. The line platform at Victoria offers no physical barrier between a standing passenger and the track. The edge is marked with a painted yellow line. Beyond it is about 20 inches down to the top of the rail and a deeper recess beyond the rail. There are no platform screen doors on the platforms. Raymond was gesturing when he stepped backward. Witnesses described him as animated, arm extended, weight shifting, midpoint. He did not check behind him. As he shifted weight backwards, his heel slipped off the platform edge and he pitched backward over the lip. He struck the near-running rail with the rear of his skull on impact. Several nearby witnesses heard the impact immediately. He did not move after contact. His right arm was pinned beneath his torso. His left leg rested at an unnatural angle against the platform face. Blood appeared at the back of his head within seconds. Elaine later told investigators she had still been talking when he disappeared beside her. Nearby passengers immediately alerted station staff using the platform emergency intercom. After the emergency intercom was used, control isolated traction power and authorized staff to descend. Platform staff reached the track bed within about 4 minutes once power had been cut. Emergency services were contacted about 90 seconds after the fall. Paramedics found no pulse and no response. He was later pronounced dead at the scene. The line was suspended in both directions. Several witnesses gave statements. The coroner later recorded no evidence of a pre-fall cardiac event, and toxicology returned no alcohol. Investigators found no third-party involvement and concluded the fall was accidental. The incident appeared in transport records as a minor platform accident and received no significant press coverage following the family's request for privacy. Authorities issued a brief operational statement and logged the incident. They opened an internal review of edge safety at that platform while respecting the family's request for privacy. Raymond was buried 10 days later. His only son, estranged, was not present. Elaine did not speak publicly beyond her statement to investigators. It was November 4, 2013. The midday heat at a popular Mumbai amusement park pressed down on crowded pathways as thousands of visitors moved between attractions. Ravi Deshmukh, a 39-year-old food vendor, stood behind his fried snack stall. Ravi had operated seasonal food stalls for 6 years, moving between festivals, fairs, and amusement parks across Maharashtra. He specialized in fried street snacks. working 12-hour shifts during peak seasons to support his wife and 2 children in Pune. He had learned the trade from a cousin and picked up equipment maintenance through trial and error, never receiving formal training in gas system installation or safety protocols. The amusement park contracted him seasonally, valuing his low overhead costs and popular menu items. The park had previously allowed seasonal vendors to store spare cylinders under counters, despite local safety codes requiring certified connectors, leak detection, and annual inspections. Propane food vending demands proper pressure regulation, threaded connections, and leak detection. Being heavier than air, leaks pool in low areas. Concentrations of 2.1 to 9.5% are explosive near ignition sources, although odorized frying and crowd noise masked the smell. That morning brought unusually heavy crowds. By 12:30 in the afternoon, Ravi had already served over 200 orders when his primary propane tank ran empty during a surge of customers. Rather than closing temporarily, he immediately retrieved a replacement cylinder from storage. Working quickly in the cramped space beneath his serving counter, he threaded the connector onto the tank valve. Investigators later determined the fitting had resisted during installation, but Ravi continued tightening it, applying extra pressure. The connector had actually cross-threaded, not fully seated, leaking slowly into the enclosed lower compartment. He turned on the gas supply without performing a leak check, despite standard safety practices requiring one. Propane began escaping immediately into the enclosed lower compartment of his stall. The odor was faint, masked by cooking smells and poor ventilation. Within 8 minutes, explosive concentrations had built up in the confined space. At 12:47 in the afternoon, Ravi reached down to ignite his second fryer. The electric starter spark from the fryer element created a single spark. The accumulated propane ignited instantly in a violent deflagration. Witnesses described a bright orange flash, followed by a sharp cracking boom as the stall frame jolted upward under the pressure wave. The blast came from the propane air cloud. The cylinder was thrown by the pressure wave. The metal frame buckled outward as canvas walls disintegrated. Ravi was thrown backward 3 feet by the blast wave. His exposed skin blackened and clothing ignited. The explosion sent the propane tank tumbling into the crowd. Metal fragments and structural debris struck 2 guests standing 6 feet away. One suffered a severe leg laceration from flying sheet metal. The other sustained a fractured wrist and facial burns. Ravi collapsed beside the destroyed stall, his airways severely damaged by superheated gases. Nearby vendors immediately began shouting for help as smoke billowed upward. A vendor operating an adjacent beverage stand grabbed his radio and contacted park security. The park's fire suppression team arrived with extinguishers and medical supplies. City Fire Brigade units reached the scene moments later with advanced equipment and paramedics. Despite immediate treatment, Ravi died at the scene from catastrophic thermal injuries to his respiratory system and chest. The medical examiner determined he had inhaled flames directly, causing fatal damage to his lungs and airway. The amusement park implemented mandatory gas safety training and certification for all food vendors the following season. Local news coverage appeared briefly in a weekend safety feature but generated little public attention. It was June 22, 2019, at a family compound in rural northern India. The afternoon was warm and the compound was active. A large gathering was planned for that evening and preparations had been underway since midday. Food had been arranged, roles had been assigned, and one chicken had already been selected and set aside for the meal. The compound was full of people moving between tasks. It was a busy afternoon with no room for disruption. Ravi Kumar was 18. He was known within the family as quick to act and capable with his hands, but also impatient and reluctant to admit fault when things went wrong. He had grown up on the compound and was familiar with how things worked. He understood responsibility and he understood what the evening meant to the family. He had been given a straightforward task that afternoon. While handling the chicken, he lost control of it. It flapped free, cleared the low wall at the back of the compound, and dropped into the irrigation well behind the property. And this is where it starts, not with a dangerous decision, just an 18-year-old who made a mistake and did not want to say so out loud. The well was deep, narrow, and stone-lined, with stagnant water at the bottom. It had been part of the compound for years and was not considered a hazard in everyday use. From above, it appeared dark and still, with no noticeable smell. What was not visible was the condition of the air below. Decomposition in the stagnant water had reduced oxygen levels, creating an oxygen-deficient environment. There were no visible signs or detectable odors, and anyone descending would not immediately recognize the danger until their breathing became affected. And this is the part I find deeply unsettling. Ravi looked over the edge. The chicken was visible at the water surface below, flapping weakly. The problem landed on him immediately and completely. The chicken had been selected and accounted for. The gathering that evening depended on the preparations going as planned. Every person in the compound knew what had been set aside and why. It had been his mistake, and he knew it. Voices from the compound carried clearly from only a short distance away. Help could have been called without difficulty. Someone with rope, someone to hold a line from above, someone to assist. All of it was within reach. Ravi did not call for help. Calling for help meant explaining what had happened. Explaining what had happened meant standing in front of the family on the evening of a gathering and admitting that he had lost the chicken down the well through carelessness. I kept coming back to this part. Most people have been 18, made a mistake, then wondered if they could fix it before anyone noticed. That instinct is human. It just shouldn't have led him down that well. He found a rope and lowered it into the well. He did not secure it to anything fixed above. He did not fasten it around his body. He did not tell anyone what he was doing or where he was going. No one was positioned at the surface to hold the line, monitor the descent, or assist if something went wrong. He began climbing down alone, hand over hand, feet braced against the damp stone wall. The wall was uneven and wet. As he descended, his footing slipped on the stone surface. He lost his grip and fell the remaining distance into the water below. The fall was short, but the landing was disorienting, and he went partially under before regaining the surface. He attempted to stabilize himself in the water. Within moments, his breathing became strained. The sensation was not pain. It was difficulty drawing a full breath, a heaviness that came on without a clear cause. Soon after, his coordination began to fail. His limbs did not respond the way they should. The oxygen-deficient air at the bottom of the well was already affecting his system. He had no way of identifying the cause from inside it. He called out. His sister was nearby in the compound when she heard him call out. She went to the well and looked down, seeing him in the water below, moving irregularly and clearly in distress. She read it as a fall followed by panic, unaware the air below was the real danger. There was no smell or visible sign from the surface. From her perspective, he needed to be reached immediately. She climbed down after him using the same rope, with no one above to hold it and no awareness of the air condition below. I find this hardest to process. She was not being reckless. She was being a sister. She saw her brother struggling and she went in after him. She reached him. There was no secured line and no one above to pull them out. Shortly after, her breathing became strained and her coordination began to fail, just as his had. Both were now in the same confined space, partially submerged in oxygen-deficient air, with no one aware of what was happening. By the time other family members arrived at the well, both Ravi and his sister were unresponsive inside it. Recovery of both required careful approach from above. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as asphyxiation in an oxygen-deficient confined space, compounded by water exposure and the inability of either individual to exit the well unassisted. Investigators confirmed that Ravi had entered the well alone without securing the rope or informing anyone. His sister had followed, unaware that the environment itself was the danger. The well remained unchanged following the incident. Deep, narrow, stone-lined, and poorly ventilated. Guess what? The chicken was later recovered from the well. And that is the one that stays with me. The chicken started all of this, and in the end it was still there. While doing my research, I came across this case completely by accident. I was 3 days into researching a completely different topic when I found it buried in a rail incident report, and I could not move on, because this one makes you wonder how dumb one can be.
It was August 18th, 2015, and San Antonio, Texas was deep into its summer. Afternoon temperatures were sitting above 95 degrees, the kind of heat that shortens tempers and makes everything feel more urgent than it probably is. The neighborhood was quiet on the surface. Residential streets, fenced yards, houses set close together. The kind of block where raised voices carry between properties and a dispute between neighbors doesn't stay private for long. By the time the argument reached the fence line, at least one neighbor had already stepped outside to see what was happening. Zenny Kryn was 47 years old. She worked in logistics dispatch, a role that runs on pressure, tight timelines, and the expectation that problems get resolved quickly. People who knew her described her as someone who didn't back down easily in a conflict and who pushed harder when she felt she wasn't being heard. On the afternoon she died, she was in the middle of an argument with a homeowner, a man in his mid-50s who worked in contracting, over a vehicle parked in a way she found unacceptable. The argument had started at the street and moved toward the property line. What strikes me about cases like this is that the personality description almost always sounds the same. Someone who pushed back, who didn't back down. And every time, I find myself wondering if they knew that about themselves, or if it just felt like being right. The homeowner was inside his yard, behind a closed gate. He told her clearly not to open it and come in. The reason was direct. There was a dog loose on the property, and it was territorial. He wasn't being vague. He was telling her exactly what would happen if she came through that gate. Neighbors outside at the time later confirmed they heard the exchange. She opened the gate and stepped into the yard. The dog, a large, powerful breed consistent with guard-type dogs documented in the area, was loose within the enclosed space. A fenced yard with a single gate doesn't offer many options when something goes wrong, and the gate she had come through was now behind her. The dog reacted immediately. The combination of an unfamiliar person entering the enclosed space and the elevated voices of the ongoing argument triggered a defensive response. It moved toward her and made contact before she could turn back toward the gate. She attempted to retreat. In the initial struggle, she lost her footing and went down. Once on the ground, the dynamic shifted. The dog targeted the upper body and neck, behavior consistent with territorial defensive aggression in large breeds during a sustained encounter in a confined space. The enclosed yard gave her nowhere to move. The homeowner moved to intervene. Neighbors who heard the commotion called emergency services. The attack continued for a sustained period before the dog was successfully restrained. Witnesses described the homeowner making repeated attempts to intervene before the animal was finally brought under control. The confined space, the fall, and the time it took all contributed significantly to the severity of what followed. Severe trauma and significant blood loss occurred during the encounter, particularly from injuries sustained to the upper body and neck. Emergency responders arrived and secured the scene. Zenny Kryn was pronounced deceased at the scene. The official cause of death was traumatic injuries and blood loss sustained during the attack. Animal Control took custody of the dog for evaluation in accordance with local regulations. The homeowner cooperated fully with investigators throughout the process. Witness statements from neighbors confirmed that multiple warnings had been given before she entered the yard. The gate had been closed. The warning had been explicit. Investigators concluded the incident was a fatal animal attack following unauthorized entry into a secured private property. The record was straightforward. The warning was documented, the entry was documented, and the outcome followed directly from that one decision. I don't say this to be harsh, but the homeowner did everything right in that warning. He told her what was in the yard, why she shouldn't enter, and what the risk was. The outcome wasn't a failure of the warning. It was a failure to take it seriously.
It was October 9th, 2015, and the crisp autumn air filled an outdoor archery range in the hills outside Boise, Idaho. Golden leaves scattered across the ground while a light breeze moved through the trees. The public range featured multiple shooting lanes, with foam targets positioned downrange, separated by wooden markers and safety signs, reminding shooters to keep bows pointed toward the targets. Roxanne Dwale, a 34-year-old warehouse inventory clerk, had recently purchased a beginner compound bow and had come to the range to practice using it for the first time. Known among co-workers for her strong-willed personality and tendency to challenge authority, Roxanne often insisted she knew better than others when handling equipment. The range attracted both experienced archers and beginners, with volunteers maintaining safety standards. Several shooters were present along the firing line during the busy afternoon session, adjusting sights, retrieving arrows, and taking turns stepping up to shoot while others watched from behind the safety line. A range volunteer approached the shooters to deliver the standard safety briefing, reminding everyone to keep bows pointed downrange and only knock arrows when ready to shoot. The volunteer also explained that distractions or arguments on the firing line could create dangerous situations. Roxanne reacted with irritation, insisting she had read the manual and didn't need supervision. She argued that her warehouse experience gave her enough knowledge to operate the equipment safely, dismissing the volunteers' instructions while several nearby shooters exchanged uncomfortable glances. While continuing to argue, Roxanne stood near the shooting line but turned sideways toward the volunteer instead of facing the targets. Several shooters paused their practice to watch the confrontation, noticing she was still gripping the bow while speaking. During the dispute, Roxanne knocked an arrow and began partially drawing the bow while the arrow was improperly seated on the rest, still gesturing toward the volunteer. Because she had turned sideways while drawing, the arrow was pulled across the front of her body, rather than pointing safely downrange. As she continued arguing, the bowstring suddenly slipped from her fingers while the bow was still under heavy tension. With the arrow drawn across her torso at close range, the sudden release drove it forward into her upper chest. Witnesses shouted and rushed forward as she collapsed near the firing line. Range staff immediately called emergency services and secured the area, while several shooters stepped back from the line in shock. A few people attempted to provide basic first aid, carefully stabilizing the arrow while waiting for paramedics to arrive. Paramedics arrived within 15 minutes and found Roxanne conscious, but suffering from a severe penetrating wound. She was transported to a nearby hospital, but despite medical treatment, she later died from complications caused by the arrow injury. Investigators documented the scene and examined the compound bow. The report concluded the arrow had been released during an unsafe sideways draw, while Roxanne was arguing with range staff about safety procedures. Following the incident, range operators temporarily closed the facility while reviewing safety protocols and later reinforced rules requiring shooters to remain behind the firing line during safety briefings. It was October 8, 2016, in Phoenix, Arizona. The convention hall was filled by mid-morning, families moving between vendor booths, while overhead lights reflected off glass terrariums and aquarium panels lining the aisles. Edward Cahill, 37, worked as a logistics coordinator for a freight company based in Tempe. He had shown up at the Pet Expo alone on his day off. Colleagues who later spoke to investigators said he was always the first to volunteer for any kind of challenge at work events, and that he treated competitions of any kind as something he was unlikely to lose. He had come specifically for the contest advertised on the expo floor map. The booth belonged to a small Phoenix reptile shop. A handwritten sign at the booth indicated it was an insect eating contest with a ball python as the prize. At the back of the table, a juvenile ball python sat coiled inside a glass terrarium under a ceramic heat lamp. The booth staff explained the contest format. Insects were pre-portioned into small cups, each cup representing 1 point. Staff would tally cups consumed within 5 minutes. Whoever finished the most cups won the snake. The available portions included mealworms, superworms, and darkling beetles, all edible species commonly used in reptile feeding and cleared for human consumption under the booth's promotional permit. At the far end of the table, set apart from the others, sat a sealed jar containing a small honeycomb section, with live bees still moving inside it. A card in front of it read that it was a bonus round worth double points, noting that the honeycomb may contain live bees and that any competitor who attempted the bonus round did so at their own risk. 6 people entered. A waiver was placed in front of Edward. He signed it without reading it. When the timer started, participants worked through their pre-portioned cups. 2 slowed within the first minute, setting cups down and stepping back from the table. A third lasted 2 minutes before dropping out entirely. The staff member tracked counts on a whiteboard. Edward did not slow down. He moved through cup after cup without hesitation, his count climbing well above everyone else remaining at the table. The ball python had not moved from its position beneath the heat lamp. When the final 60 seconds were called, the staff member unsealed the bonus jar. The buzz from inside was audible across the booth. The 2 remaining competitors looked at the jar and stepped back. Edward was already ahead by enough to win without it. The result was not in doubt. However, he reached forward and took the jar anyway. He bit into the comb. A bee stung him on the interior of his lower lip as his teeth broke through the wax. When time expired, the result was announced. Edward had consumed more than any other competitor by a wide margin. Applause came from the back of the crowd. The staff member moved toward the terrarium. Edward coughed once, then again harder. He set a hand flat on the table and swallowed with visible effort. Someone near the front of the crowd asked if he was all right. He did not respond. His lips had begun to swell and his breathing had become audible from several feet away. A woman beside him said he was choking. Someone else laughed, assuming it was a reaction to the insects. Then his legs gave way and he went down against the side of the table. Expo staff called for emergency services immediately. 2 paramedics already stationed inside the convention hall reached the booth within 3 minutes and found Edward unresponsive on the floor. Treatment was administered on site before he was transported by ambulance. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as anaphylaxis triggered by bee venom. Edward had already secured the highest count in the contest before attempting the bonus round. Event organizers later removed the live bee portion from the contest format following the incident. The ball python remained inside its terrarium at the back of the booth, still coiled beneath the heat lamp, uncollected. It was September 18, 2017, in Mesa, Arizona, at the intersection of Southern Avenue and Dobson Road. Late afternoon heat hung over a crowded intersection as cars idled through a long light cycle, waiting for the signal to change. Darla Whitman, 48, worked as a cashier at a neighborhood grocery store in Mesa. Co-workers described her as blunt and quick to argue when customers questioned coupons or prices at the register. She insisted on following store rules exactly and often pushed back when shoppers challenged them. Managers had received complaints about her tone, but she showed up on time and frequently covered extra shifts. Darla drove a 2012 Nissan Altima and kept a compact .380 pistol loaded in the center console. Family said she began carrying it after a roadside argument years earlier, keeping the gun within reach during everyday drives between work, errands, and home. At about 4:35 p.m., traffic along Southern Avenue slowed again as the signal changed. Vehicles rolled forward a few feet and stopped. As the line tightened near the intersection, a pickup behind Darla's Altima bumped the rear of her car at a very low speed. The contact left minor scratches and a shallow dent in the bumper. The pickup driver stepped out and approached with his wallet in hand, ready to exchange insurance information. Witnesses later said he appeared calm and apologetic. As the traffic light turned green, horns began sounding behind them as drivers tried to move through the intersection. Darla opened her door and stepped directly into the lane instead of moving her car. She walked between the vehicles and began shouting at the pickup driver about the damage, pointing toward the rear bumper of her Altima. Several motorists waved for both drivers to pull into a nearby parking lot entrance, but Darla remained in the roadway, continuing the argument as traffic stacked up behind them. The signal changed again while the lane remained blocked. Horns echoed across the intersection as drivers tried to squeeze around the stopped vehicles. Darla ignored them and returned to her Altima, opening the driver's door and reaching into the center console. When she stepped back into the lane, she was holding a compact handgun in her right hand. Witnesses later told investigators the pistol remained pointed generally downward as she continued arguing across the front of the vehicles. She raised the gun slightly while gesturing toward the pickup driver, using it like a pointer as she continued confronting him in the middle of the lane. During the exchange, she stepped closer to the pickup's front bumper and struck the metal grill with the side of the handgun to emphasize her point. The impact jolted the weapon in her hand, and as it struck the grill, the pistol discharged once. The bullet struck high on the left side of her chest, just below the collarbone. Darla staggered backward and collapsed beside the driver's door of her Altima. The pistol slipped from her hand and came to rest on the pavement near the lower edge of the door. Emergency services were called immediately as traffic slowed around the intersection. Fire and medical crews arrived within minutes and attempted resuscitation beside the vehicle, but circulation could not be restored, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported the bullet entered the upper left chest, passed through the lung, and severed a major vessel near the heart, classifying the death as accidental. Investigators closed the intersection for several hours, documenting the roadway, collecting witness statements, and recovering the pistol from the pavement nearby. It was March 3, 2018, on the 7th floor of a downtown parking structure in Dallas, Texas. By the time anyone understood what had happened, a man was already lying on the concrete below. Darrow Velton, 44, lived in Plano and worked IT support for a mid-sized logistics firm. Co-workers knew him as someone who improvised solutions rather than waited for official channels. He once rewired a home outlet instead of calling an electrician, patched a radiator hose with zip ties that surprisingly held for months, He was methodical, precise, and deeply confident in his own judgment. That afternoon, those same instincts led him to handle a problem most people would have handed off to someone else. He had parked on the 7th level before a routine business meeting. When he returned, his keys were visible on the center console through a passenger window cracked open 3 inches, close enough to see, too far to reach. A woman named Gail, loading bags into her vehicle nearby, offered her roadside assistance card. Darrow declined. His key fob was dead, the keys had slid beneath the console lip, and the window gap seemed like all the opening he needed. Gail watched him walk toward the outer face of the structure. She assumed he was going to try jimmying the window somehow, maybe with something from his trunk. Instead, he stepped over a low parapet at an unsecured maintenance access point and disappeared around the exterior edge of the wall. She stopped what she was doing. She moved closer to the parapet and looked out. He had his back pressed flat against the outer wall, both hands gripping a raised concrete lip at shoulder height, his feet balanced on a narrow decorative ledge no wider than a few inches. 70 feet of open air dropped behind him to the street below. He was moving sideways, heel to toe, in the direction of his car window, slowly and deliberately, like a man who had already decided the risk was acceptable. Gail called out to him. He either didn't hear her or didn't respond. She stood at the parapet and watched, bags still in her hands, unsure whether to keep calling or stay quiet and let him concentrate. He had moved about 4 feet, then 6. She counted the distance without meaning to. At 8 feet, without any sound of warning, a section of the concrete lip broke free from the wall. She saw his body rotate away from the surface, arms out, back arching, and then he was gone. The crack of the concrete separating was sharp and immediate. The impact from below came less than 2 seconds later. Gail stood at the parapet for a moment without moving. Then she dropped her bags and called 911. Emergency responders arrived at 3:53 p.m., approximately 6 minutes after the call. When she spoke to police, she described the concrete giving way as instantaneous, no crumbling, no warning, just a clean break. She said he had looked completely in control right up until the moment he wasn't. The chunk of concrete lip that had separated from the wall was recovered near his body on the lower level apron below. Darrow was pronounced dead at the scene. The county medical examiner listed the cause of death as blunt force polytrauma, consistent with a fall from significant elevation. Skull fracture, cervical spine fracture, bilateral rib fractures, internal hemorrhaging across multiple organ systems. Manner of death was ruled accident. A locksmith later retrieved Darrow's keys from the vehicle, which sat unclaimed in the structure for 3 days before the city ordered it towed. The incident received a brief item in a Dallas area newspaper. Following the death, the garage operator commissioned a structural inspection of all exterior ledge surfaces. Inspectors cited rebar corrosion and freeze-thaw spalling as the likely cause of the concrete failure. No charges were filed. It was August 9, 2015. The air inside a family entertainment center in Bangkok, Thailand, hung thick with humidity and the sharp scent of recycled air conditioning. Niran Suti, a 28-year-old delivery route supervisor, had spent his Saturday afternoon at a nephew's birthday celebration, unaware that the children's play area would become the site of a preventable death. Niran worked for a regional beverage distribution company, managing delivery schedules across Bangkok's commercial districts. Co-workers described him as outgoing and physical, someone who took jokes too far when drinking. He had consumed 3 large beers with lunch at a nearby restaurant before arriving at the entertainment complex, a detail his sister would later confirm to investigators. His job required early mornings and long hours coordinating drivers, leaving weekends as his primary social outlet. Indoor play zones in Southeast Asia typically feature ball pits as centerpiece attractions. These are enclosed areas filled with lightweight plastic balls, designed for children to jump and play safely. Standard safety guidelines recommend pit depths between 24 and 36 inches, and in this installation the balls rested above a rigid plastic base with minimal cushioning beneath. The pits create an illusion of soft landing zones, but the shallow depth and firm foundation pose serious risks for adult body weight. That afternoon, Niran arrived at the party around 2:30 in the afternoon, visibly intoxicated according to multiple witnesses. The entertainment center's ball pit measured roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, filled with approximately 24 inches of multicolored plastic balls, resting directly on a hard plastic base. Warning signs posted in Thai and English prohibited adult entry, maximum capacity limits, and diving. Staff members were occupied with another birthday group in the arcade section. and no staff member had been assigned to actively supervise the play structure when Niran began joking loudly about jumping in. His sister told him to stop, but Niran was already climbing onto the perimeter ledge. Other parents watched but did not intervene, assuming he would step down. The ball pit appeared deceptively deep from surface level, the colorful balls concealing the shallow depth and hard base beneath. Without further warning, CCTV footage showed Niran launching himself headfirst from the elevated edge. The impact was immediate and devastating. His skull struck the rigid plastic base through the thin layer of balls. His body weight, approximately 180 pounds, drove him down with full force. He did not surface or move after entry. His torso sank face down into the balls, chest compressed against the unyielding foundation. The position prevented his ribcage from expanding, limiting his ability to breathe normally. Children continued playing around and on top of him, unaware a man lay dying beneath them for approximately 15 minutes. The balls shifted back into place after the dive, concealing his body beneath the surface. His dark clothing blended with the dim lighting inside the pit. The party area was separated from the play zone by a glass wall and filled with loud music from an adjacent celebration, further delaying recognition that something was wrong. At 3:02 in the afternoon, a group of children digging toward the bottom reached Niran's face. One 7-year-old noticed his open eyes were not blinking and alerted her mother. The parent immediately notified staff, who cleared the pit before 2 employees coordinated his removal within 3 minutes. Staff trained in CPR initiated resuscitation, while emergency services were contacted. No automated external defibrillator was available anywhere in the facility. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes later, transporting Niran to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead with autopsy findings, indicating primary blunt force cranial trauma with secondary positional asphyxiation. The entertainment center permanently banned adult entry to all children's play equipment following the incident. Local authorities later cited the facility for inadequate supervision of the play area during peak occupancy hours. It was June 15, 2016, in a residential neighborhood in suburban Florida. The afternoon was clear and dry. Single-story homes lined both sides of the street, open driveways, lawns maintained, and outdoor air conditioning units positioned along the side walls of most houses. It was a weekday afternoon. Most residents were indoors with their air conditioning running. Ronald Pierce, 58, had worked for over 30 years as a maintenance supervisor for a mid-sized facilities management company before retiring 2 years prior. His career had been built on hands-on problem-solving. Colleagues and former staff described him consistently as self-reliant to a fault. He did not ask for help when he believed a task was within his capability, and his threshold for what fell within his capability was broad. And look, I actually understand that personality type completely. 30 years of solving problems yourself will do that to a person. The problem is that instinct does not always know when to stop. Several years before this incident, Pierce had left a ladder unsecured outside his property overnight during a home repair job. It was gone the following morning and was never recovered. From that point forward, he did not leave tools unattended outside, even for short periods. That afternoon, Pierce observed a frisbee on the roof of his single-story home. It did not belong to him. It belonged to the child at the neighboring property. No one had knocked on his door to ask for its return, but Pierce wanted to bring it down. Pierce retrieved his ladder from the garage, carried it to the front of the house, and positioned it against the roofline without assistance. Before climbing, he paused at the base of the ladder. The driveway was open and visible from the street. He made the decision to take the ladder with him. After stepping onto the roof, he knelt at the edge and dragged the ladder up behind him, sliding it fully onto the roof surface beside him. This decision removed his only means of descent, and this is the part that gets me about this case. He did not do it carelessly. He thought it through. He was protecting his ladder. That one decision is what made everything that followed unavoidable. He crossed the roof surface without difficulty and retrieved the frisbee. The task took less than 2 minutes. There was no ladder at the roofline. The drop from the roof edge to the driveway was approximately 10 to 11 feet. He did not call out to a neighbor. He did not go to the rear of the property to assess other options. He started looking for the closest means to get down. Pierce identified the outdoor air conditioning unit mounted on a narrow concrete pad along the side wall of the house as a possible intermediate step for descent. The unit sat elevated off the ground, positioned close enough to the roofline that lowering himself onto it appeared to offer a controlled route down. He moved to the edge of the roof, turned onto his front, gripped the roof edge with both hands, and lowered himself until he was hanging from the roofline, his feet directed toward the top surface of the unit below. What gets me about this part is that he actually felt it was a reasonable thing to do. The unit was not designed or rated to bear the full body weight of an adult. The mounting brackets were not anchored to the wall. As Pierce transferred his weight onto the unit, it slid on the concrete pad beneath it. His footing went first as the surface shifted under him. His grip on the roof edge failed a moment after. He fell. His left shoulder took the first impact, followed immediately by the left side of his head striking the ground. He had no opportunity to brace. The left side of his skull made direct contact with the concrete pad. The skull fractured on contact and his brain shifted inside the skull from the sudden deceleration, tearing blood vessels along the surface. Bleeding began immediately. He did not move after landing. Neighbors heard the impact and found him face down and unresponsive within minutes. Paramedics arrived at the scene shortly after and began assessment. Ronald Pierce had no recoverable vital signs at the point of arrival. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as fatal head trauma with associated internal injuries consistent with an uncontrolled fall onto a hard surface. Investigators discovered that Pierce had climbed onto the roof using a ladder he subsequently dragged up and placed on the roof surface beside him. No secondary means of descent had been arranged before climbing. The ladder was recovered from the roof surface where Pierce had placed it. The frisbee was found beside it. It belonged to the child at the neighboring property. The child had not asked for it back, and the fact the child had not asked for it back is the one I cannot move past. He went up there on his own initiative. Nobody was waiting for that frisbee. Now, the next case is the one that I find hardest to categorize in this entire video. It's something entirely different. It is about what happens when embarrassment becomes more urgent than safety.
It was July 20th, 2017, and Phoenix was in the middle of one of its most punishing summers. Temperatures at the city's main airport were hovering above 105 degrees that afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the tarmac shimmer. It was a busy travel day. Gates were full, ground crews were moving efficiently, and flights were running on schedule. Carolyn Floss was 45 years old. She worked in retail management, the kind of role where authority was the default, and being overruled didn't sit well with her. By multiple accounts, she was someone who pushed hard against rules she found inconvenient and expected exceptions to be made. On that afternoon, she was traveling with her 14-year-old nephew, and the two of them arrived at their gate late. Not marginally late, but late enough that boarding calls had already gone out multiple times. By the time they got there, the jet bridge door was sealed. The aircraft, a smaller regional jet, had finished boarding, and the crew was already in pre-departure procedures. A gate worker explained the door was closed and the flight was not returning to the gate. That did not go over well. Carolyn began arguing with the staff, raising her voice, filming the encounter on her phone, and accusing the workers of abusing their authority. Other travelers watched. Multiple staff members tried to de-escalate. None of it landed. I want to be fair. Missing a flight with a teenager in tow is genuinely stressful. I get that. What I don't understand is what she did next. While attention near the gate briefly shifted, she moved toward a service access point along the side of the terminal, a door used intermittently by ground crew for ramp access. In that narrow window, she made it through into the secured ramp area. An alarm activated the moment she crossed that threshold. Ground personnel on the ramp spotted her and moved to intercept, shouting for her to stop. She did not. She continued moving across the active tarmac toward the aircraft, which had just begun taxiing away from the gate with its engines running at low to moderate power. The fact that it was a smaller regional jet matters here. That type has engines mounted lower on the fuselage, which puts the intake hazard zone much closer to ground level. Most people never think about what that kind of engine does to the air around it. By the time you feel the pull, you're already past a point of no return. As she moved into the marked hazard perimeter, the airflow became strong enough to disrupt her footing. Witnesses on the ramp later reported seeing loose debris near her shifting toward the engine. Her clothing pulled forward. She lost her balance and went down on the pavement. The intake forces at that range pulled her further forward after she lost her footing, drawing her deeper into the immediate hazard zone where she sustained severe blunt force trauma.
The flight crew initiated an emergency engine shutdown within seconds of visual confirmation. But that call, fast as it was, came too late. This is the story I just couldn't stop thinking about. Not because it was so shocking, but because she had so many chances to turn around and just kept going. Emergency responders secured the ramp area within minutes. Carolyn Floss was pronounced deceased at the scene. Her nephew, who stayed in the gate area, was taken into the care of relatives. He was not physically harmed. Investigators reviewed alarm logs, ramp footage, and statements from gate staff and ground crew. Findings were consistent. Safety systems were active and functioning throughout. Warnings had been issued at every stage. She continued past all of them. The incident was classified as a fatality resulting from unauthorized entry into an active aircraft movement area and contact with engine hazard forces. No equipment failure was identified. No airport procedural failures were found. Everything worked. The alarm triggered. The crew responded. The systems did exactly what they were built to do. The only thing that failed was the one decision that started all of it.
It was August 12, 2017, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Atlantic City, New Jersey, as tourists moved along the bustling boardwalk district. A steady ocean breeze carried the sense of salt air while seagulls circled overhead. The coastal location experienced frequent wind gusts that were particularly noticeable at elevated heights. Tindy Flagg, a 26-year-old hotel front desk clerk, had just finished her shift at one of the establishments near the boardwalk area. Known among co-workers for her attention-seeking personality and tendency to dismiss rules she considered unnecessary, Tindy frequently pushed boundaries when taking photos for social media. She often believed that warnings and restrictions were exaggerated and rarely hesitated to ignore them if they interfered with the kind of dramatic photos she wanted. After work, Tindy walked with two co-workers toward a nearby parking structure that offered panoramic views of the Atlantic City skyline. The multi-level concrete building provided an unobstructed perspective of the boardwalk and ocean beyond. Although the rooftop level was designed strictly for vehicle parking, visitors occasionally treated it like an observation spot, something Tindy immediately saw as an opportunity for another attention-grabbing photo. The trio took an elevator to the top level, where the open-air design allowed for sweeping views. Wind conditions were typical for the coastal location, with periodic gusts that created noticeable air movement across the exposed rooftop. A concrete barrier approximately 3 feet in height ran along the perimeter, designed to prevent vehicles from driving over the edge. A maintenance worker performing routine inspections noticed the group and approached them. He explained that the barrier was not intended for people to stand or sit on, and that it existed only to stop vehicles from driving over the edge. He also warned that wind conditions at that height could shift suddenly across the open rooftop. Tindy brushed off the warning almost immediately, treating the workers' concern as unnecessary interference. She insisted the barrier looked solid and acted as if the restriction was exaggerated. Her co-workers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but Tindy continued moving toward the edge while preparing her phone for a photo. Even as the maintenance worker repeated the warning, Tindy climbed onto the 3-foot concrete barrier and stood upright on the narrow surface, holding her phone at arm's length. She positioned herself to capture a selfie with the Atlantic City skyline behind her, completely exposed to the coastal wind sweeping across the rooftop. As she leaned backward to widen the selfie angle, a sudden gust pushed against her upper body. The unexpected force caused her to lose her balance on the narrow concrete edge. Her foot slipped on the smooth surface as she tried to regain her balance, but she fell backward over the outside edge. Witnesses reported that she fell approximately 60 feet, landing on the concrete pavement outside the parking structure. The co-workers who had accompanied her immediately called emergency services while other bystanders secured the area. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and found Tindy unconscious on the pavement with severe trauma from the fall. Paramedics provided immediate medical care, but she was pronounced dead due to injuries sustained from the impact. Police investigators documented the scene and interviewed witnesses. Security footage from the parking structure provided additional evidence. Officers confirmed that Tindy had climbed onto the safety barrier despite warnings from maintenance staff. The official report documented the fall as accidental, noting that the victim had positioned herself on a safety barrier not designed for pedestrian use. It was June 14, 2015, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The afternoon had started clear and warm, the kind of early summer day that felt settled enough to get things done outside. Dennis Hartwell, 52, worked as a shift supervisor at a packaging plant on the north side of the city. He had lived in his house on Clearview Avenue for 14 years and spent most weekends working through a list of yard projects he had been adding to for months. He had spent most of that Saturday outside. By late afternoon, he had installed a tall aluminum flagpole near the front of the property, tightened the final sections of a metal fence along the side yard, and mounted a satellite dish on the edge of the roof. It had taken longer than expected, but by early evening the yard looked the way he had intended. He went inside briefly, then came back out as the light began to change. The storm had been visible on the horizon for some time before it moved in. Dark clouds had been building to the southwest through the late afternoon, and distant thunder had been audible for nearly an hour. The Weather Service had issued a severe thunderstorm watch that morning, though the timing of its arrival had been forecast for later in the evening. The storm moved faster than expected. Wind swept across the neighborhood as the first drops of rain reached the street. A flash of lightning lit the cloud base somewhere beyond the hills, and the thunder that followed came several seconds later. Most of the houses on the block had gone quiet, interior lights visible through closed windows. Every other person on the street had gone inside. Dennis remained outside near the fence line. He had spent the entire day on that yard. He had installed the pole himself, tightened every bolt on the fence, climbed up to mount the satellite dish. He was not going to let a storm that had not fully arrived yet end the day before he was ready. The flag moved steadily against the pole in the rising wind. The aluminum pole stood several feet above the roofline, the highest structure on the property by a considerable margin, positioned in open ground with nothing around it taller than Dennis himself. Another flash brightened the sky. The thunder followed in less than 2 seconds. The short gap between the lightning and the thunder indicated the storm had moved directly over the neighborhood. Dennis stayed where he was. A bolt of lightning struck the flagpole moments later. The strike traveled down the aluminum pole and into the surrounding ground. Dennis was standing only a few feet from the base when the current spread through the soil beneath him. A neighbor passing by on the street saw Dennis on the ground near the fence line and called 911. Emergency responders arrived minutes later and found him unresponsive. Resuscitation was attempted at the scene. Dennis Hartwell was pronounced dead before transport. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest following a lightning strike. Investigators documented the height and placement of the newly installed flagpole and noted it was the tallest metal structure on the property, positioned in an open section of the yard. It was July 29, 2015, in Union County, New Jersey, at the Garden State Parkway Toll Plaza near exit 140. Summer heat hung over dense weekend traffic as long toll lines crept toward the booths. Easy pass-only lanes moved slightly faster, while the staffed booths slowed to a crawl. Across the slowed lines, Lydia Crane, 57, owned a small residential cleaning service in Newark. Her days were spent driving between supply warehouses and apartment jobs across the city, often trying to squeeze extra appointments into a tight schedule. Employees described her as impatient with delays and quick to argue when something slowed the day. Traffic and long toll lines frustrated her, and stalled lanes often led to disputes with workers or other drivers. That morning, she was heading south for supply pickups and 2 cleaning estimates, which meant using the Garden State Parkway despite the usual weekend congestion. The toll plaza near exit 140 carried steady traffic heading toward the coast, with signs warning drivers to remain inside their vehicles, while easy pass lanes continued moving through the booths faster than the staffed lanes. Lines feeding the staffed toll booths stretched across the pavement. Cars moved forward a few feet at a time as each booth cleared another vehicle. When the line paused again, Lydia opened her driver's door and stepped out, leaving her sedan in the booth lane. Witnesses said she walked toward the toll window with her hands raised, angrily complaining about the delay and the slow-moving line. The attendant signaled for her to return to the car because traffic was still moving through the plaza. Lydia turned toward the line of cars behind her and threw her arms out in frustration. Drivers began honking as the booth lane remained blocked. Instead of returning to her vehicle, she walked away from the booth area toward the striped pavement separating the booth lanes from the EZ pass lanes. Several drivers shouted for her to stop as she stepped past the painted hash marks that marked the restricted zone. The markings separated the stopped toll lanes from the EZ pass lanes where vehicles continued moving through the booths. Lydia ignored the warnings and continued across the striped pavement, moving directly toward the EZ pass lanes. Vehicles were still passing through the EZ pass lanes as drivers slowed while approaching the toll toll canopy. Lydia stepped into the first easy pass lane while looking toward buildings across the roadway, apparently trying to cross the plaza instead of returning to her car. A commuter sedan entered the easy pass lane, traveling about 30 miles per hour as traffic slowed, approaching the toll canopy. Witnesses said the driver braked as soon as Lydia stepped into the lane, but the distance was short. The front right side of the sedan struck Lydia before she reached the center divider. The impact lifted her onto the hood before she rolled off onto the pavement as the car came to a stop. Drivers in the booth lanes stopped and moved back as emergency services were called, and toll workers halted traffic through the easy pass lanes. Responders arrived within minutes and attempted life-saving measures, but Lydia was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported severe blunt injuries to the head, chest, and pelvis that stopped breathing and circulation within minutes. Investigators spent hours documenting the toll area, and Lydia's sedan still waiting in the booth lane where she left it. Witnesses confirmed she walked into the traffic lanes despite warnings. The driver remained at the scene and cooperated. Investigators concluded the driver had no reasonable chance to avoid the collision.